welcome to ITE Canada Career Connect with Kate. My name is Kate Whitfield, and I'm a principal with Alta Planning Design in Ottawa. So as usual, the goal of each and every episode is to help people looking for jobs in Canada in the field of transportation engineering and planning connect with others. So the theme for this episode is actually from a posting on LinkedIn where I said to everybody, what do you want covered? And I'm going to read out the questions because they came right from Umair, and I'm really proud that you're here to talk about this with us. So the questions were, what kinds of jobs PhD graduates do in the field of transportation planning engineering in Canada? How different is their work from non-PhDs? And what alternative career paths exist where someone with transportation engineering qualifications does not want to become a professional engineer? So those questions were posed to me on LinkedIn. I put them out there in the world, collected some people together to talk about it. So we'll see where this conversation goes. So as usual, we'll start with sort of 2 minutes introduction. I'll just share a name and a little bit about each person, and we'll go around just to sort of tell a story about yourself, introduce you to others, and then we'll get a conversation going. So of course, first is the person who posed this episode idea. So I'll pass it to you, Umair. Umair is a PhD student at the University of Windsor, but I want to hear about what you're up to. So I'll pass it to you.
Thank you, Kate, for this opportunity. I'm now a postdoc at the same lab. And at the beginning of my PhD, I started with this question, how do transportation engineers use traffic simulation software? Particularly, I was looking into car following models where a vehicle is predicted while moving behind another vehicle, what its speed and acceleration and so on. And so it's important because simulation results are used in looking at implementation of self-driving vehicles, safety countermeasures in the field, and vehicle emissions estimation, etc. So I found that most transportation engineers in industry don't really understand how these underlying algorithms work in the simulation software, and they mainly just calibrate the model parameters to get some desired result. And the models themselves are pretty limited in terms of using a constant reaction time, while studies from psychology and neuroscience suggest that that's not how human behavior works. And so I set out to do my own experiments with driving simulator, collected the data, and then it confirmed that indeed drivers react intermittently. They don't react continuously like a robot. So I then developed my own car following model and then validated it not only on my data, but also on publicly available vehicle trajectories data. So in the course of my PhD, I gained a lot of different skills about data analysis, programming, machine learning, etc. And I'm now looking forward to use these skills as I transition to industry. I'm keen to talk to others, other presenters today. Thank you.
Great, and I love it. I heard human behavior in there, which, you know, it piques some interest. And then those that love simulation modeling in there too, but that's great. And thank you for posing these questions. So the next person that we'll get to talk and introduce himself is Andrew. Andrew, it's sort of representing the person currently working, employed in the field in Canada, but with a PhD in hand. So a transportation engineer with Englobe, based in Fredericton, New Brunswick, and another UNB grad with a PhD from UNB, my alma mater. So on that note, I'll pass it over to you, Andrew.
Yeah, thanks, Kate. So yeah, as introduced, I'm a transportation engineer. I earned my PhD studying road safety, so specifically looking at how safety performance changes when you signalize intersections and how to try to account for that in that process. But now that I'm working as a consultant, I kind of do a whole range of different things. Which is also not that uncommon in the Maritimes, where I go in and some days I'm doing traffic studies, some days I'm making transportation master plans, some days I'm working on stuff for our civil engineering unit. And one project that I thought really kind of encapsulates the type of bigger scope stuff that I tend to get tasked in my role. We had a business case that we needed to develop or help the Department of Transportation with here for rehabilitation of the Harbor Bridge in St. John. Not sure how familiar all of you are with that city, but it's one of the larger ones in New Brunswick, and it has two parts that kind of span across the St. John River, and there's two bridges that facilitate getting across it. Total of 6 lanes of traffic. And for this study, we needed to look at a base case of, well, what if we don't rehabilitate this bridge and we have to close it? So we didn't have any origin destination. We had some traffic volume data, but no origin destination stuff across this bridge. And I had to go in and figure out what the realm of possibilities would be for the, I think it was like 40,000 vehicles per day that go over this bridge, like how they would filter through the rest of the province's transportation network to try to get around that bottleneck via the 2-lane bridge that would be remaining. There's a whole bunch of river ferries that they would have to go through, taking pretty substantial detours around the city in general. But yeah, like I thought that was a good example of the big, like I tend to get those projects that have kind of a bigger, weirder scope to them that are maybe outside the box of what we typically do. And my PhD tends to help me with being able to take those on.
That's awesome. I love projects with bigger, weirder scopes. It also keeps it interesting in our careers. Wonderful. So next, I'll pass it over to another PhD candidate. This time, Carleton University. So we're I guess we haven't met yet in person there, Hussein, but we both live in Ottawa.
True.
I'll pass it over to you to introduce yourself.
Right. My name is Hassam Sioufi. I'm a PhD student at Carleton University. My field of interest is basically road safety, and my PhD mostly focuses on automatic traffic monitoring systems. So when you install cameras at intersections, so you want to detect, track vehicles. At the same time, you want to know the exact position of the vehicle in terms of its all angles. Nevertheless, I'm interested in detecting the next vehicle's maneuver, meaning predict the next few seconds position. So mostly like surrogate safety measures, which is like a traffic conflict technique. So it's one of the ways, instead of depending on crashes and collisions as a matter of safety, you depend on conflict techniques, which define the evasive actions of the drivers. So this is one of the ways to eliminate collisions, is by understanding the evasive maneuvers and the traffic conflict problems. So my PhD mostly involves like introduction of applications that help detect these encounters rather than being dependent on the human, because these encounters, in order to be detected, they're very intensive work. And with the technological revolution or the recent advancement of computational power, the applications of machine learning have been so powerful in my understanding, and they've been so advanced and open source. So this is one of the most of my applications, and PhD is like that. It involves detection and evasive maneuver detection and so on. So yep, that's it.
No, that's great. Wow, thank you. I love how we have engineers, but we also have planning represented here too. And I saw the recent promotion of ITE for planners to get memberships. So there's other information on the ITE website about that, but that real push that ITE really is a community of engineers and planners as well. So I love that the next two guests bring that side into this picture where we talk engineering and planning. So Homa and I, we met recently in Toronto. I want you to explain your own background, but another sort of someone carrying a PhD in urban design with a sort of a connection to architecture. So I'll pass it over to you, Homa, to introduce yourself.
Thank you so much, Kate, for giving me this opportunity, and it was great seeing you in Toronto. Yeah, my background is urban design and planning, and with architecture background as well. I have worked on several research projects on community planning, social sustainability, mobility, inclusive city, and transit-oriented development. I work collaboratively with teams from multidisciplinary background, and I worked on travel survey, analyzed data, and using qualitative and quantitative analysis, and making urban models and using different softwares. I worked as a research intern with Economic Development and Cultural Division, City of Toronto, and I lead urban research on the street and monument titled Toronto Recognition Audit. Another position I had with City of Toronto as an intern, it was collaborating with municipal licensing and the standard division, and my role was to support the program manager of bylaw enforcement to provide a report on key performance indicator and licensing data. Also, I have conducted several research on community planning, and my PhD thesis was assessing the effect of different urban forms on social sustainability, and try to design an environment which encourage healthy lifestyle and is open for elderly and disabled people. And thank you so much for your time.
Oh, absolutely, Homa. I mean, your resume and your education, like having finished your PhD and looking for working in the Toronto area, organizations like ITE Canada and others need to be where you're connected to, so that you get you get into the field here, right? Like we've talked about. So it's wonderful that you just put yourself out there too, right? It's you were speaking at an event recently, like it's really wonderful. So I'm so glad you're here.
Thank you
So
so much.
our last guest is Robin. So Robin and he was the keynote speaker at the Winter Cycling Congress in Montreal, 2017, and then we've been Twitter. Are you friends on Twitter? I don't even know. You follow each other. You think you know each other, but you don't. You meet on here, right, Robin? And you say, why don't you come on and come on and participate? Because you're someone that I remember in, working through PhD and postdoc and where to land and for a career after all, accumulating so much experience and education. So I was like, come talk here, and also another way to get to know each other more, right? So I'll pass it to you to introduce yourself.
Well, thanks for the invitation, Kate. It's nice to be here with everybody. I guess I'm unlike most people here. I don't have really any formal training in urban design or planning or architecture, but I had an interest in it because I was an occupational therapist for 5 years. So I did my master's in occupational therapy in Toronto, and working in community settings, I started to notice that perhaps the built environment was more of an impediment to well-being than personal responsibility of the people I was working with. Mostly, tons of variety, but just mental illness in general. And then I got burnt out because of what I saw to be an inefficient system. So I quit being an occupational therapist and randomly just, I don't know how I got the job, but I ran a startup accelerator at the Northern Alberta Institute of Technology. But it was there where I was exposed to design thinking, specifically Stanford's D School, and combining that design thinking approach of really empathizing with the user and reflecting on why I'd left my job as an occupational therapist. I realized that perhaps there was some necessity for a better understanding of how different aspects of urban environments impact mental health. So I did my PhD in cognitive neuroscience. Focused mostly, my dissertation focused on how being in the presence of tall buildings or skyscrapers impacted people's psychological and physiological states, with this kind of dystopian bent on the future as to what would be like for humans if they were living in cities and it was just skyscrapers everywhere. And on the side, I did a few other projects looking at placemaking interventions in Vancouver, and another project that involved measuring brain waves as people use different levels of cycling infrastructure to look at really trying to measure human attention and the implications on safety. And in January, I'm off to start a postdoc in Berlin to be part of a research consortium called the Research Platform for Neurourbanism.
I mean, you started that with that you had a different spin to this, and maybe you do, but I mean, every conversation we've had is about, right, how urban environment affects well-being, and that's something the profession needs to be talking about, right? Everyone needs to be talking about, not just, yeah. So I'm glad you're here. Yeah, so I can start this conversation going in a bunch of places. I mean, if I just say, what type of jobs can someone with a PhD have? The answer is any. So that seems like it seems shallow, right? If we start from that. So we could explore that, but also I want two layers to this. Because if that's true, then what are the barriers to getting a job? So like part of these episodes is being really honest and blunt. And that is, I'm sure you get a lot of, oh, you're overly qualified for the position. That you can't pretend that doesn't. And I'm someone who writes job postings and reads resumes. And if I saw a PhD, I might be like, well, you're great, but you're overly qualified. So then what doors open to you? So, I want to talk about what opportunities are out there, but I also want to have that kind of honest conversation about what it's like. Andrew, I'll pass it over to you.
Sure. So, I mean, for me, getting a job after my PhD, I there was a lot of luck that was involved with the process. I live out here in Fredericton, New Brunswick, which is not the largest of communities. There's only a handful of places that could have potentially hired me. And actually, my job hunt was rather dependent on what my partner was doing. So like she had spent the last year of my PhD looking for work, and I'm originally from Ontario. We were looking for some stuff that was, she was looking at opportunities back home and elsewhere in Canada. She happened to get a full-time job in Fredericton in the last year of my PhD. So then it's like, oh, I guess I'm trying to find an opportunity here too. And being, like I said, a smaller city, smaller market, I got very fortunate that the DTI, so like the Department of Transportation and Infrastructure here in the province, had just the right project come up that required my specific experience coming out of my PhD that was contracted to one company that I was then able to kind of slipstream my way into and get a job that way, because I was just a very natural fit for it. But even doing that, it was working through my contacts, the various people that I'd met through like our chapter ITE meetings and stuff like that through the I guess the section or student chapter, and just really reaching out to people that way. I had also gone to lots of conferences just to meet different people. I don't know if Kate remembers, but we did bump into each other at ITE in Ottawa back in 2019. Awesome. Very briefly.
Awesome. But there might be a tip in there. A university that has a PhD program might have a culture of the consulting firms in that town that have a connection because of research projects that are tied to some of the contracts that the consultant has would be a connection in for someone through school. Maybe that's in there too. Even with networking, I was really tempted to look through the IT Canada directory for the PhD holders. I know a few of them as another way of direct networking to sort of say, what does your company do to have these bigger ideas or other thinking to open that up. Does anyone else want to sort of add in there? So it's a little bit about types of jobs and a little bit about how to get the jobs.
I believe I can add something.
Great.
In the past, from what I understood, that in the past, most of the jobs for a PhD involved either teaching or research. Others involved private companies or public sector, whether it's provincial, municipal, or federal government. But there has been a recent trend, in my understanding, which is like technological startups in translation sector. For example, creating a software, for example, in terms of like I said, like detection, solving problems for the government instead of the government doing the data themselves. So there's this part where, with the recent advancement in technological revolution, you could have startups or you could work in a company that is probably a technological company. So this is one of the areas that I found that is possible for a PhD graduate if the PhD graduate has experience when it comes to programming or a certain type of programming. So this is something I found out new.
Yeah, that's really great. Thank you. That's really helpful. It's a good idea.
Also, I want to add, as you said, Kate, as a PhD graduate, it's really challenging to find a job most of the time you are overqualified. I believe joining a relevant organization or a professional and being a volunteer member and networking is really helpful. I personally joined YPT, and also I was a student member in OPPI and CIP. I think it's really helpful. You can attend the conferences. I presented my paper in different conferences related to people environmental studies in IAPS, EDRA, ACSP, recently in Toronto. I think those tips gonna be very helpful for people who want to find a right job.
That's great. And then, but Homa, the other part is you might come across as overqualified, but put it out there, right? At the same time, like when we were talking about how you network, you might be fearful of putting it out there because then it gets you ruled out, but it also, wow, right? Like it tells a story, it shows so much depth, right? So when you're writing the resume high up there on there, making it clear like that background that you have, I think is really important because you have so much to bring. And the organizations, ITE Canada has a travel bursary to get to Winnipeg in June for the conference for women in transportation engineering and planning. So there's other places that can help, but it's building that network too to get your name out there.
Thanks a lot. Sure.
Yeah.
Something that I think I can kind of build upon that. When it comes to like looking for a job, odds are, if you have a PhD, you might be overqualified for like an explicit job posting that comes up. Like I know a lot of the times when employers are putting together a job posting, they've got like a specific job effectively, contract that they're looking to fill with that role. So they probably already have a type of profile in mind that doesn't necessarily include somebody who has a PhD. And to that effect, it can be a lot more helpful to be reaching out through like doing your networking and reaching out to people kind of indirectly, because PhD candidates would make really solid growth hires at a lot of places. They would just need to be able to see where that fit could be within their organization, as opposed to necessarily being for like an explicit posting.
Oh, that makes a lot of sense too, right? Sometimes it's the doors opened and then other conversation had. Absolutely, Robin, you're up next. I want to hear your comment, your tip.
Thanks. Yeah. So I convocated like at the peak of the or defended at the peak of the pandemic, and so my post PhD job search was complicated to say the least. But something that to build on what Andrew was saying around talking to different companies or organizations about the potential for new roles. What I do is in itself is an emerging area. So environmental neuroscience just came up. The term came up like 3 years ago. So it's a very, very new field. But I always saw a role for what I did within an urban design context. So I tried cold calling and reaching out to people, and it didn't work out. But within the last month, I was contacted by a large international design company. I'll say that because I signed a non-disclosure agreement. But once I got into the company and saw what was happening, I was fascinated to see that there were a few people like me. It's just not very apparent. And so I think, persisting and really learning how to um, I don't want to say like understand your brand, but like understand what your contribution is and where it fits within an organization. If you have that down, then I think it'll be easier when that random conversation might come up with someone you met on a plane or at the coffee shop.
That's really great. So instead of putting someone on the spot for their brand, can I put it back to you, Robin? Like, what would be like your brand? Is your brand urban environment well-being, or is your brand neuroscience? Like, can you help with what a brand is?
Yeah, I mean, I think personal branding, just in terms of how people can find you on the internet, is one thing to consider, whether that's your LinkedIn, your Twitter, or your website. But I definitely think that, especially for PhDs, you're always balancing this kind of the tension of being too specialized and not being a generalist, and where you kind of sit in that spectrum. So maybe something to think about with the brand is the most like uh, versatile qualities that you have, and then how you would then fit that into whatever the mission or the specific type of work that company is doing. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I just, whenever we give these advice, sometimes we have to be that. Sometimes I got asked, if I walk up to someone at a conference, what do I say? Like sometimes our best tips are like that direct. So even Homa, when I was thinking about you, it's more than planning, it's more than urban design. It's also your architecture. Like not all urban designers have an architecture training too. You may assume they're, but I mean, that's part of your brand is the architecture connection to planning, because planning is such a broad word. You do need something that differentiates you as a planner. Um, and I always say that, like, just transportation engineering planning isn't enough because people need to figure out: are you a modeler? Are you sort of like a designer? Are you a people person? Are you better at engagement? Right? Like, it doesn't mean you have to do one thing, but it helps someone see you in their organization, right? Umar, do you have anything to add here?
So, so one advice that's shared is on being specialized. So you have a specialist knowledge in a certain area, and then you use your brand or make your brand around it. And as Robin also mentioned, that there are new things that people are not yet aware of. And so if you have a specialization that industry does not accept yet, then how would you market that? And I've also heard contradicting advice, which is that you should be ready to do something else. Not everything that you've done in your PhD would be something that you'd be able to continue. Uh, in academia, that's possible, but in industry, that may not be possible.
Okay, how about the second part first? So, yeah, I mean, I'm in consulting. Our workload is dependent on what we win, what we get paid to do sometimes. Like it's not necessarily, we don't get to script. So it's not just that your specialty can't be all the time. That's my field, right? Like we could win all types of one work and there just isn't that. But that's not really a problem, right? Like your PhD and your thinking is what you're bringing as a package of skills. So then your first part, I don't know, Robin, do you want to take that first part of his question or do you want Umar to repeat it? Because there's a lot in there.
Yeah, could you repeat the question, please?
The first part there.
Yeah, so what I understood from your comment on creating a brand is that you have a specialist knowledge in a certain area. You create that brand and then market yourself as a specialist of that. So what if there is not much acceptability of that thing yet, as you also mentioned? How would you then go about doing other things? Yes, there are transferable skills that you can use, but how would you market that?
I think that's just a general problem for PhDs. And when I was at Waterloo where I did my PhD, I did a like one of my research assistantships was actually just with the faculty or the Office of Graduate Studies, and my job was to work in this grad venture program, and it was to figure out how to bridge the gap between academia or the PhD education and industry, because if anyone looks at the stats, it's highly unlikely that you will get a faculty position if you get a PhD in Canada just by the sheer numbers. Um, and we were trying to figure out uh, where to start. And so they actually developed an actual certificate that lists all these competencies that are sought out generally within industry. But a lot of it was just one-on-one conversations with students to really pull out what they're good at and how that maps on to the industry that they're in. And I think it's just going to be an uphill battle until industries of all types recognize the fact that PhDs are just going to be a part of those spaces. But I think, like, you know, branding yourself on the specificity is important, but at the same time, you don't want to look like you're not versatile. So you're good at, you know, just as your expertise is, you did your PhD, and obviously we're going to be experts in something, but really trying to pull out maybe the methodologies you use. So if you did qualitative research, that's basically, I think, a phenomenology or grounded theory or ways to understand how people feel about things, which in planning and design in general is part of the process. It's engagement. Maybe someone wouldn't see those skills as part of the PhD, so it's really highlighting those other kind of softer skills that come with the dissertation that you have to write.
Well, this is great. I do want to make sure we answer your other question, Umair, which was not getting a professional license and other options. It's kind of neat. There was a few people that responded on LinkedIn on that one particularly, and both had the same theme. So plenty of opportunities for engineers in business and sort of with business analytic mindsets. Either MBAs, but also sort of the PhD brain helping to contribute to conversations around pre-feasibility, economic, and stakeholder development was one of the answers. And then how U of C's PhD program actually helps with entrepreneurial skills and new idea development. So I thought that was pretty neat. I think your question, though, I mean, we don't need to spend an episode on whether someone should get their license or not. That's, I think, a separate thing. But Umair, do you want to explain any more about why your question came up? Is that why, does it concern if someone doesn't head down the route to those letters? Is that those other letters, I would say, because there's a lot of letters going on here. But you worried about not having a professional engineering license?
No, not personally, but so what I see mainly where the professional engineering license is required is where you are doing a lot of like construction plans, approvals, and transportation or traffic impact statements, and so on. So if you don't want to do that, you want to do something else, but you still require a license. So if your work is more heavy on data analysis, would you still
Okay.
require a license for that?
I get it. So true. Maybe you're not stamping engineering designs, but that's maybe because of type of work or what you're hired to do. That someone could not be doing that. But I mean the license and the P.Eng also just communicates a commitment and to that professional license and a code of ethics. So I think it's more it's almost more personal. I don't know. I'd open this up to others, but we have to acknowledge that doctor and the PhD letters in itself communicate something as well in terms of commitment to the profession and code of ethics. But anyone else want to sort of cover that subject of licensing?
I mean, I guess I can step in here and say a couple words, but it's largely going to be what Kate said. It's very much going to be like a role to role or employer to employer thing, just depending on what your situation happens to be in terms of what you're signing for, what you're doing. You know, if somebody's looking at what you're doing, and like if you're working underneath someone in a role, but I know even most professorships would require you to have a P.Eng if that's the route that you end up going through in Canada. And a lot of the times it's a kind of like standardized set of letters that people will just expect to see. It's like, oh, you went through all this engineering training, and like we kind of want somebody who has the P.Eng to be doing stuff, even if it's in, if you're working in like a specialist modeling firm that really just makes like a modeling platform. Clients would probably still like to see that there are people within that company who have their P.Eng, even if it's not necessarily like explicitly required for legal or safety or benefit to the community reasons. But yeah, it's going to be very situation specific.
I believe I can add a little bit of what on Umair in the first point that he wanted to mention. In the P.Eng, I think it's good to work in projects that are not related to academia every now and then. For example, at the current moment, I'm working on the movement of the Ottawa Hospital, the civic hospital, from one location to another. So one of the projects that I'm working now with my professor and a couple of colleagues is what are the impact? What should we do? So I'm learning now how to use Vism, which is a software I haven't had a chance to use. And this software is an important software if I want to get my P.Eng as an experience. Adding to that, we're using TIA guidelines. We're using the LOS, which is multi-model level of service, which defines that we could work into the areas of non-academic. But the part that Robin mentioned, which is I feel is correct, there's always this gap between proof of concept and deployment in production. And even before proof of concept, there's also another gap, which is proof of theory. So first of all, there's the theoretical part, and then there's the proof of concept, and the third part, which is deployment in production. The gap, in my understanding, could be minimized with community engagement. For example, in Carleton University, they have enhanced a new project, I think with the university president, which is we should engage more in community engagement. So what do the people really want? So the academia is always, there's this gap, which is theoretical and good. And maybe 30 years later, you'll find someone creating a company from it. But to fill that gap, which is the proof of concept and deployment in production, it requires a systematic engagement between public sector, private sector, and also the community. And this is where I feel with if the government or the people, they could engage in that, we could have fill or minimize that gap between proof of concept and deployment in production. Thank you. Yeah.
No. And no, but what you bring up is, I mean, we cover so many different points when we share here, and I don't want to go right to the resume stuff, but what you just talked about too you would communicate that when you're writing a firm, your research, but also that project. Exactly what you just said. A little bit of that description would go a long way in someone seeing you in their practice. So that was really good. So making sure people get access to that information about you is really good. That's really good. So thanks everyone. This is a really good conversation. We covered a little bit about private sector, a little bit about university employment. Didn't really cover city jobs and PhDs, but maybe someone can add some commentary on LinkedIn about that one. So I guess, Robin, why don't I pass it over to you? Do you have anything else you'd like to sort of add here to keep the conversation going?
Yeah, so just over the course of my job search, both industry and academia for the past couple of years, I had a good amount of contact with companies like Google and Facebook, just learning about what's happening. Again, they do lots of work behind the scenes that no one would really know about, but I think that would be a space to watch for people, particularly with the training of your audience. They're buying companies that do urban design, and this intersection between technology and the built environment is just increasing. It's going to increasingly be, I think, of interest and perhaps even a necessity in like the design planning. So I just wanted to put that out there that maybe look at those boards, but even try to get in touch with someone who works there, because that will help you get past a lot of the red tape that can be a barrier.
That's great. Well, thank you, everybody. This has been a great conversation. Thank you, Umair, for proposing it. And to other people watching, pitch an idea for a subject, and then through ITE Canada, we use our resources to try and get the right people together. It's kind of like a game Steve and I do to try and see what topic we can cover next. I think one about co-op programs is sort of brewing in my mind as something also to cover next time, maybe. Anyway, so thank you everyone for helping today, and for those that are watching, follow ITE Canada on their website and their YouTube page, because that's where we keep these episodes, and we'll just keep going. Whenever we have an idea to talk about, we bring people together and we keep connecting. So thank you.